Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our study this evening on the heart of the matter, our special summer study looking at various attitudes that the Christian should have toward various elements of life as we encounter them. This evening, we're going to be dealing with lesson 13, which is the Christian's attitude toward employment. Now, we've said with these lessons, there's so much more to each of these subjects that we can deal with in one sitting. But I hope that the few things that we can discuss briefly will be a springboard for you to think about them more deeply and maybe discuss them with your family, your mate, or your friends, and help us come to a better understanding of God's Word and a better attitude toward the things that we, again, will encounter in this life. So let's think tonight for just a few minutes on work or employment. We'll be thinking about not only going out into the world, if you will, and engaging in secular work outside the home, but many of the things that we talk about will apply to all elements of our labor, including wives and mothers within the home. But first of all, let's take a look at the idea of work being ordained of God. That is, when we go back to the book of Genesis, we look at the very beginning of the creation of the world, the creation of man. After God has put everything in place, in Genesis 2 and verse 15, it says, "Then the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to tend and keep it." I don't know what that means entirely, but it does appear that there was something of productive labor to be done. God also gives the instruction for Adam and Eve to fill the earth and subdue it. And so it does seem that God had more in mind for mankind than mere relaxation in a garden where everything was automatically supplied. There were things that they needed actually to do. And not long after this passage in Genesis 2:15, God brings the animals to Adam to have him name them. So there's one example of something productive to be done. Whatever was involved, it seems to be something that was less stressful and less trying than what comes upon mankind after the fall. So in Genesis 3, speaking to Adam, he says, because in verse 3:17, "Because you have heeded the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree of which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat of it, cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat of the herb of the field. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return." And so there does seem to be a drastic change in the composition of things and the condition of things after the fall that was going to make Adam's labor much more difficult and trying than it was before his sin. And so this is the world that we live in. We don't live in the Garden of Eden. We live in a world where a significant amount of time and effort must be expended to make a life for ourselves here. It might be that in the extremity of these efforts and in the toil and in the care and the frustration and all that comes along with it, we might curse the necessity of labor. Why do I have to go to work? Why is this so much a large part of our lives here on the earth? Why does it take so much of an investment of time and energy to eke out a living in this world? But let me say that even though what is pointed out here in Genesis 3 is that this is part of the curse of the fall and the change of the world in which we now live, God has graciously turned this work effort into a blessing. And we'll see that as we go along a little bit further. But there is good to come from work and from our labor. And in fact, I think it's a great benefit to us if we look at it the proper way. And so God has infused work with elements of joy and satisfaction. We have quoted here from Ecclesiastes chapter 2 and verse 24, "There's nothing better for a man than that he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw was from the hand of God. And so enjoying the good that comes from our labor, this is a gift from God. This is a blessing from God's hand. That is, that in the aftermath of the fall, God did not make our toil and labor just pure misery for us, but he infused it with something good. Also in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 12 and 13, and there are several passages like this in Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 12, I know that there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and to do good in their lives, and also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. It is the gift of God. So once again, God has blessed us with work, with labor. It may not seem like that all the time, but such is the case. Chapter 5 and verse 18 of Ecclesiastes, along the same lines, here is what I have seen. It is good and fitting for one to eat and drink, and to enjoy the good of all his labor in which he toils under the sun all the days of his life, which God gives him, for it is his heritage. Now, we'll look at some other ideas later in the lesson to kind of keep these things in perspective. Solomon here is not saying that everything in life revolves around our work, but he is saying there is an element of it that is rewarding and satisfying, and we should look to it for the enjoyment that it brings to us. So there are a lot of things we could probably say to flesh out this idea of the blessing of work. I'll just suggest an idea or two, but number one, work brings structure and focus to our lives. It occupies an energy and a concentration on our part that might otherwise be used for evil. And so while we might think that there's such a large proportion of our life dedicated to work and to labor, it may be that that's actually what God intends, that it's a good thing, that it's honorable, that it's got an upside to it. And to be so gainfully employed and productively employed does keep us from finding our way into evil. And I think we can see the opposite of that in life. When men do not have work, when they are not focusing on a good and honorable way of living, there's just plenty of trouble for them to find in their lives. There's also a sense of fulfillment in having completed a task, having done something worthwhile, having contributed something to family, to the good of humanity. There's a sense of pride in that. There's a sense of satisfaction, a job well done. And so these are just some of the things that represent the blessings that God has given to us in labor and in spending a good part of our lives in productive activities. Well, from that, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about getting work out of focus. So work in its proper proportion, in its proper place, is a good thing and brings blessings to us. However, like any other blessing of God, we can get out of balance in these things. They can take on a role that God did not intend and perhaps come to dominate our life in one way or another, or in this case, one extreme to the other. So let's look at one extreme and think about the workaholic. And by that term, I mean someone who is spending an inordinate amount of their lives and their energy and their focus in work. They've gone overboard with it. Now, we might wonder why someone would do that. And again, the reasons are many, and we don't have time to explore them all. But I'll suggest a couple. The first one I suggest here is escapism. That is, especially for a man, though it is possible for a wife and a mother in the home, but so often with a family, a man is the one that is going out to a place of business and perhaps being gone for hours during the day. And so it may be that in order to escape domestic responsibilities, perhaps elements of that a man might find unpleasant, or maybe to escape spiritual obligations or other tasks of life that just may be deemed undesirable. It may be that some immerse themselves far too much in their work. That may come in the form of spending voluntary time at the office. It may involve volunteering for trips to be made. When so doing, perhaps gives a man some respite from being in the home, but places such an added burden on his wife when he is gone. And of course, we can do this in the reverse. We can think of perhaps women who work outside the home, and sometimes those are mothers. And so there's the crush of domestic duty and responsibility and nurturing of children along with her husband, but on top of a secular job outside the home. This can be overwhelming. And so it might be that the mother actually chooses to work in order to escape what she might feel is a drudgery or the boredom of being at home. Whatever the case, it is easy, I think, to go overboard and immerse ourselves over much in work. And so for others, it may be not so much the escapism. It may be that work becomes their self-identity. And so it might be that the promotions that come with the job, the pats on the back, the advancements, the pride that comes with that, or the increased pay, the perks that come with the job, the power that comes with climbing the corporate ladder, if you will. All of these things might be strongly attractive to people, and so much so that they begin to identify their being or their worth with these achievements that come outside the home, outside of their families. And for these people, it may be that career achievements take precedence over the relationships of their family. And this is sad. When this occurs on whichever part, the man or woman, it's going to be perceived by the mate, and it's going to be perceived by the children. When a father prefers, and I'm not saying there are not occasions where beyond someone's control they're taken outside of the home, but if extra assignments are volunteered for and in fact relished, and one prefers to be outside of the home, that's going to be communicated. Children are very perceptive, and mates are very perceptive. And so it may be that in sort of abandoning these relationships, we're going to add a lot of stress into our family lives because of the choices that are being made. Solomon, again writing, this time in Proverbs, says, "Do not overwork to be rich. Because of your own understanding cease. Will you set your eyes on that which is not? For riches certainly make themselves wings. They fly away like an eagle toward heaven." Proverbs 23, verses 4 and 5. And there are other verses in Scripture that advise us to keep work and the material things that it provides in balance. Yet so often these warnings go unheeded. Again, it may be that we are gaining more satisfaction than we should, or we've elevated work to a place that it really doesn't deserve. And if we do that, we'll be harming ourselves, and we'll be harming those that will be neglected because we've over-focused on work. Well, let's look at the other extreme, and that is the sluggard. That word itself doesn't sound very pleasant, does it? Sluggard. It sounds like laziness. Onomatopoetic, maybe. It just has the sound of someone that's just not motivated. They just don't have any impetus to work. Someone that lacks industry, and there are a number of proverbs that address this particular condition. One of which is Proverbs 6 in verses 6 through 11. Let's read that. Proverbs chapter 6, verses 6 through 11. "Go to the ant, you sluggard. Consider her ways and be wise, which having no captain, overseer, or ruler, provides her supplies in the summer and gathers her food in the harvest. Oh, how long will you slumber, O sluggard? When will you rise from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep. So shall your poverty come on you like a robber, and your need like an armed man." We've got a couple others to look at here, also in Proverbs. Proverbs 24, beginning in verse 30. Proverbs 24, beginning in verse 30 through the end of the chapter. I went by the field of the slothful, and by the vineyard of the man devoid of understanding. And there it was, all overgrown with thorns. Its surface was covered with nettles. Its stone wall was broken down. When I saw it, I considered well. I looked on it and received instruction. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. So your poverty will come like a prowler, and your want like an armed man. I'm sure we've seen properties like that. Perhaps on TV, we're watching some of these home makeover shows, and you see property that's just been neglected, and weeds growing up into the inside of the house from the outside, and shingles and falling off, and holes in the roof and whatnot. It takes a lot of energy, again, to maintain ourselves in this world, and it's easy to fall into indolence and a sluggishness that just lacks industry and lacks attending to the things that need to be done in life. Chapter 26 of Proverbs, beginning in verse 13, the slothful man says, there's a lion in the road. A fierce lion is in the streets. As a door turns on its hinges, so does the slothful turn on his bed. The slothful man buries his hand in the bowl. It wearies him to bring it back to his mouth. The sluggard is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who can answer sensibly. He's always got a reason not to work, not to put forth an effort. And we, again, see this even in other passages in Proverbs. The man that doesn't want to sow in his fields always finds a reason not to sow. And if we let little interruptions or aggravations of life get in our way, and we might have a tendency toward indolence and toward laziness, there's any number of things in this life that will keep us from accomplishing what we should. And so we've got quite a lot of warnings in Scripture about not only being a sluggard or underachieving, but even from nature being given an example by the lowly ant to show us what can be done if we just move a little bit every day. A little bit here and there goes an awful long way. Well, in the New Testament, we find an example, if you would turn to 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, an example of some Christians who fell into indolence or lack of industry because of a misguided theological idea. That is, they weren't necessarily sluggish or sluggards by nature, but they had come to believe the idea erroneously that the Lord would be returning soon, and so soon that they began quitting their jobs and not being gainfully employed. And Paul is writing to correct that. He actually has some pretty harsh language here in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 about these who have become, as he says, disorderly in this process of not working as they should and basically becoming freeloaders or indigent and dependent on others to take care of them. 2 Thessalonians, beginning in verse 6 of chapter 3. But we command you, brethren, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you withdraw from every brother who walks disorderly, and not according to the tradition which he received from us. For you yourselves know how you ought to follow us, for we were not disorderly among you, nor did we eat anyone's bread free of charge, but worked with labor and toil night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you, not because we do not have authority, but to make ourselves an example of how you should follow us. For even when we were with you, we commanded you this, if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat. For we hear that there are some who walk among you in a disorderly manner, not working at all, but are busybodies. Now those who are such, we command and exhort through our Lord Jesus Christ, that they work in quietness and eat their own bread. But as for you, brethren, do not grow weary in doing good. And if anyone does not obey our word in this epistle, note that person, and do not keep company with him, that he may be ashamed. Yet do not count him as an enemy, but admonish him as a brother. So Paul is talking here about a condition of life that he calls disorderly. So what is the order? What is the life that is being lived in a godly, orderly, proper, balanced fashion? It's a life of one who's working. Disorderly is to not work. And as we said, in this particular context, it's because of a wrong-headed idea, a false theological conclusion that there's no need to work because the Lord's going to come deliver us from this world any day now. And Paul says, no, you have been led astray on that. And so he's counseling the congregation here to actually expel Christians that will not work because their lives are disorderly. They're not following the dictates and the desires of God. And he condemns busybodies here. We said earlier that a man who is not working and devoting himself energetically and productively in this life has a lot of free time on his hands. And unfortunately, that free time can be spent in evil endeavors. And so here, a man that's got a lot of free time will find his mind drifting into things that he shouldn't be concerned about. And so being disorderly in this way, or being a busybody specifically, Paul is condemning and saying you need to be busy and you need to be gainfully employed and not dependent on the congregation. This leads to all kinds of evil. I've shared with you in your notes a quote from Hendrickson's commentary, sort of summarizing this whole viewpoint. He says it is necessary to grasp the deep root of this labor philosophy. As we see it, the apostle is proceeding from the idea that those who were saved by grace should become so unselfish that they will loathe the very idea of unnecessarily becoming a burden to their brothers. And on the other hand, that they will yearn for the opportunity to share what they have with those who are really in need. And we'll say something about that a little bit later. But here's the idea of being industrious and being busy and working, is that we're not a burden on others. And sometimes this is not possible. Sometimes circumstances of life conspire, and we might find ourselves dependent on others. And the New Testament speaks extensively about that. Contributions that Paul was taking up to transport to Jerusalem for the brethren who were in need there. But to choose this, to choose dependence, to choose to be a burden on others is not the way of Christ. It is not the life, and it's not the mindset that the Lord wants us to have. So let's move on and then talk about some attitudes toward laboring in this world. Point number 3 here on page 2, Christians should honor the agreements upon which they were hired. Most everyone who has a job has some expectations for that job, whether it's a written contract, an oral contract, just simply an understanding. In this day and time, many jobs do involve the agreeing to a contract or a program of work. And it is the obligation of God's people to honor what they said they would honor and produce what they said they would produce with their employer. And this can lead to problems. When a Christian is devoted to his covenant with his employer, to that contract, to the agreement, it may be that he finds himself pressured by his work peers. Hey, you need to slow down a little bit. You need to relax. You're making us look bad. You're actually showing the boss how much can be done in a day, and we've sort of conditioned him to have lower expectations by dragging our feet. I mean, they might not say it that way, but that's the message that may be communicated. You're outworking us, and we don't like it, is maybe more how it would come out. So we might be encouraged to cut corners or work less or cheat or lie, to do something dishonest, to change a contract with another company, to shortchange in the contract, to do sloppy work. I mean, this can come out in all kinds of ways. But when we enter into a contract, we're going to do this much work for this much compensation, then that's what we're bound to do. And so even though at times the job becomes onerous to us, or it's unpleasant, or we're tired, or we're overworked, it may be that we don't feel like producing up to the level of our agreement, but we need to fight against that. Now, here's one way that can be done. If you turn to Ephesians chapter 6, Paul is talking in this context, and as we say, even a little bit further down in our notes here, that a lot of the principles that we draw from the New Testament about being an employee today perhaps come from that context of a slave or a servant-master relationship. And so basically what we're looking at here is taking the worst-case scenario, which is maybe what's presented in the New Testament, and applying it to today, which is not tantamount to outright slavery, or the kind of indentured service that may be done in cases that the New Testament may speak about. And so this is the worst case scenario, but if it applies in that setting, we would say how much more would it apply perhaps in a lesser setting. And so Paul elevates labor, any labor that we might do, by directing it as to Christ. If we enter into this, because it is the will of God, if we enter into our labor, not so much seeing it as giving to an employer or giving to a company, but what we're actually giving to the Lord, that completely changes our viewpoint of that labor and that work. In this context, Ephesians chapter 6, beginning in verse 5, Paul says, "Servants, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart as to Christ, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart." There's a lot in those two verses that help define our labor. First of all, in verse 5, he says, as to Christ. And then in verse 6, doing the will of God from the heart. What is as to Christ? What is the will of God? That we labor, that we do what we contracted to do in our case, or in this case, it's what people were bought to do. Do what you were bought to do. You belong to your master. That is your obligation. And to elevate that, to ennoble that, would have been a horrible situation to be owned. And we see that as a matter of sensitivity in our own culture, thinking back to the slavery of the 19th century. We see it here in the New Testament. To be owned by another person would be dehumanizing. It would be the loss of liberty. It would probably be great hardship in many different ways. It would be the loss of your autonomy. There'd be so many negatives about this, and it would be tempting for a Christian in this situation perhaps to shortchange his master and not give him what was owed and what was due. And so Paul elevates that service by saying, this is what the Lord wants you to do. Not that the Lord necessarily approves of slavery, but this is the situation that you are in. What is the way to deal with it? Rebellion? Running away? Doing something illegal? Fighting against your master? Being a very unpleasant servant? No, that is not direction given at all. Consider this to be labor done for the Lord. Look, that brings a whole new perspective to our jobs, to this kind of service being rendered by slaves. It really does ennoble the worker. It lifts and elevates the worker and gives his work meaning because it is to be done as to the Lord himself. And so honest effort is to be made no matter the situation. Look, this is easy to say and it's hard to do. I understand things can be very difficult in our jobs, and we can be very much challenged in this regard to do what we're obligated to do. But nonetheless, we're doing it as unto the Lord. And that should give us that extra motivation to carry on when things are not very pleasant. And so under point 3b1, top of page 2 in your notes, I made this point. It's the preacher who is working for the Lord And I want you to think about that, because I think sometimes those of us that do preach can easily put in a separate category because we're being supported by the collective funds out of the church treasury. We're being supported to do kingdom work. And that is a blessing. It's a blessing for preachers to be able to do that. It's a blessing to be supported to do that. It's a matter of great gratitude on my part through the years that I've been doing that. Now 40 years. I've been supported in various ways, in various amounts, by various churches in different situations, in different locales. But the truth of the matter is we're all working for the Lord. I don't question whether I may have some specific responsibilities as an evangelist or an elder that others may not have. That is true, I do. But when we're all working for the Lord, whether that support comes out of the treasury or whether it comes from a master or whether it comes from a company, we're working for the Lord. That's what Paul's doing. He's saying, he's elevating this. All of us are working for the Lord in a sense. No, we're not all supported out of the church treasury, but it's all the Lord's work in the sense that it is to be done as unto the Lord, and the Lord is measuring us according to what we're doing. He's evaluating us as to how well we do in our jobs, mine surrounding kingdom work, others surrounding work that would be done more on a secular type basis. And so all work is for the Lord in terms of giving honorable effort and doing that which pleases God. And so this principle applies to everyone, and I would include in that a wife and a mother. Because a woman is staying at home and working in a domestic situation does not place her under a different standard of industry because she's not in the corporate world. So both sides of this issue of labor apply to a wife and a mother in managing the home. That is, it's a great blessing and it's an honor to do that. She's fulfilling the will of God in what she does. Just like anyone else, it's involved perhaps in a more formal contract work relationship, but she also has responsibilities, just like the others that may work outside the home. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, blessings and responsibilities. But looking at all of this labor, ideally, it's elevated by Paul, it's elevated by God, because these are the things God wants us to do, to be productively and gainfully employed so that we're focused in our lives, we're disciplined, we're accomplishing, and we're a blessing to others. Well, then that brings us to point 4, our attitudes toward our employer. And we'll just note here that we certainly don't have a monopoly in our day and time on difficult people to work for. We're talking here in Ephesians 6 about masters owning slaves or servants, and so treating them as their property. And so that would be difficult. It can be very difficult in various work environments today for us to feel affirmed or joyful or happy in what we're doing. There are some people in this world that are extremely miserable. They're angry, they're bitter, they're unfulfilled, they're lost, their priorities are in the wrong place, and sometimes that is your boss. And that's a very, very difficult position to be in. But remember again, these admonitions that we're reading about in the New Testament come out of the context of masters and slaves. And many of those men, by records that we have extant today of the time period, were brutal and inhumane. There was no legal accounting for a man killing his slave. It was his property. He could do with that slave as he wanted. And it's unimaginable what some did with their slaves. And so it's not only Paul writing. In 1 Peter chapter 2, we have Peter also addressing this idea of servants and masters. 1 Peter 2, beginning in verse 18, servants, be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the harsh. For this is commendable if because of conscience toward God, one endures grief, suffering wrongfully. So notice he says, also to the harsh. There were masters that were good and gentle. There were masters that were not. There are bosses that we love to work for. There are bosses that we would rather work for anybody else but them. And so Peter is saying this is commendable if because of conscience toward God. Again, we're looking at this not from the standpoint of only the boss or only the company, but it's what we owe God. If our conscience toward God, if for that conscience we endure the grief, in this case, a master, or in our day and time, the boss, we suffer wrongfully, that is something that God commends, that God approves of. But yet these kinds of situations might challenge us very deeply, might challenge our trust in God's providence and in his care. It may be that we tend to lower ourselves to the standards of our boss or our company. It may be that we sort of give back what we're receiving, or we rely on our shrewd business savvy to deal with an unpleasant situation, or we might employ other worldly tactics. But the tactics that we're to employ as Christians are not only in times of pleasantness or times of advantage or when it's convenient. We are to treat our enemy well, Jesus says, and even when that enemy is our boss. There are certain obligations that we have, even toward those that are not treating us well or do not have our best interest at heart. Again, I realize fully this is easy for me to sit here and say, but it's very difficult when you're actually in the situation and you have people speaking to you in very harsh ways. I don't know if you've read the news the last couple of days. There's an article, prominent story about a young woman that quit the New York Times in very dramatic fashion and wrote a letter of resignation that was scorching to her employer and her supervisor. And she outlines an atmosphere at that particular paper that appears to be rather horrible to work within if you do not share the ideology that's prevalent at that particular institution. But this young woman was driven in her misery to finally resign from what I'm sure in the field is a prestigious job, to be a reporter, writer for the New York Times. But conditions were so miserable for her, she finally walked away from that job. Well, it may be you're in a job like that. It may be that the work environment as a whole does not favor Christians or morality or pure living or pure speaking. And again, you're pressured by a boss or coworkers to act in ungodly ways or just simply ridicule for not going along with the program. Let's also try to remember in times like that our boss or our company is our benefactor. In history, there have been many, many horrible situations, and we've mentioned slaves and masters, but there have been such awful ways that a man or woman has to eke out a living, literally working their fingers to the bone and not being fed properly and working without the benefit of industrialization or the modern information technology. But work for most people at most times in history has been brutal and horrible and a matter of suffering. And for the most part today, at least in this country, we're working in climate control conditions. Some of our work may be on computers. Other work may be more intellectual or head work. Even if we're in a factory, I have been in some factories, like I've been in a Mercedes factory. I've been in a Harley Davidson factory. And even if you're doing factory work, it's incredible how clean and efficient and safe most of those environments are. And so before we just look on our jobs with total negativity, let's also remember that we're being blessed greatly by the jobs that we have and in many ways. And though there's a lot of headache and stress and frustration, there's also a lot of blessing that comes to us from these jobs. And so we work in relative comfort, safety, prosperity. Let's look at the upside. Let's look at the good side and not only focus on the downside. The last major point I'd like for us to think about is work and worship. Work and worship. And so we're in a situation now where it appears, and I hear this observation. I'll start to say complaint, but mostly it's an observation, that there's more work being done by fewer people working longer hours today. It seems that the story that I get from so many is, I'm doing the work of 4 people. I'm doing the work of 6 people. I work all day. I come home. I eat supper with the family. I go back to work at night, or I work at home to get more things done. This is a common refrain in our day and time. And because of that, and because there's a lack of appreciation for spiritual things in general in this country, it may be that you have a job that forces you to miss worship on occasion. And so I'm asking the question here, is this necessarily sinful? How do we draw a line between being negligent toward worship and legitimately being involved in providing for ourselves or our families, doing the thing that God would want us to do, but then that interfering with our opportunity to worship God? And so let's explore that just for a few minutes. And it's not an easy question to deal with, and I think that it may be that we might shy away from certain answers to that, because we may not want to encourage people to miss worship, and certainly I don't want to do that. But I do think there is, in a sense, a legitimate effort to be made to support ourselves and our families, and that may put us in a situation of, on occasion, missing opportunities to be with our spiritual family. So I don't want anything we say here to be taken as permission to just be absent at will from our worship. And I do think that any and all conscientious Christians are going to be frustrated by and fret over missing any opportunity to be with God's people. We should never willfully and voluntarily choose to not be with our brethren. This is one of the highest things in life that we can do. That is to be together worshiping God and talking about His Word, studying together, visiting with each other, finding out how we're doing, expressing our love and concern for each other. There's no voluntary work in the world that's worth missing that for. But the question is it always a matter of irresponsibility or even sin to miss worship on account of our jobs? Well, the first thing I would note, which is just a general principle from Matthew chapter 5, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus there admits in principle that something else may supersede an occasion for worship. And that's where Jesus is talking about coming to offer your gift at the altar. But as you do so, what's on your mind is maybe less that act of worship and more the idea that you're at odds with someone. Someone's gotten out of sorts. There is stress in a relationship. And perhaps that's even interfering with the joy that ought to come with worshiping God. And Jesus says, lay your gift at the altar. Go take care of that situation first, and then come and offer your gift. So even Jesus is acknowledging that there are some circumstances in life that supersede even that very act of worship that he's talking about there. And so not every absence from worship is something that's an affront to God. And we can expand this again beyond our work obligations. What about staying home with a sick family member? Is it necessarily a choosing of someone over God? Are we skewing our priorities because there's a family member that needs us, and perhaps we're concerned about leaving them alone? Should we hire a sitter to come sit with that person so we will not miss worship? Well, in some cases that may be the thing to do. In other cases, it may be that our first priority might be to the one that is sick, especially if they're very sick and they're feeling not just physical ailment, but the emotional need for a family member to be with them and to be present. Should we leave them alone and go to worship? Well, maybe. Depends on the illness. Depends again on the seriousness of that. I think most of us have probably, if we're married, left a mate at home sick on occasion. But some illnesses may be of such a nature that it would not be the wisest thing to do to leave a person alone if they're not stable in some way, if they're in pain and can't do for themselves. There are all kinds of factors that enter into this picture. It may not be staying home with someone sick. It may be that you feel well enough to go to worship, but you're sick. And so out of concern for others, you may decide, I feel like going and I want to go and I wish I could go, but I'm just going to sit there and cough the whole time. And of course, we're all very conscious of that right now with COVID. And we're actively encouraging people that don't feel well, even though they feel well enough perhaps to be at worship, to not come. It's, believe me, it's very awkward to advise that, because I think our general mindset is you're to be at worship almost no matter what, to make sacrifices to be at worship. And now we find ourselves saying, well, if you have a little cough or a runny nose, it may be best not to be at worship. So the bottom line is every choice that we make necessarily an affront to God or a disrespect toward God because we have actually chosen to do something else? And I think the answer to that is no. It's not always a matter of sin that we've attended to something else first. There are a number of priorities that we have in life, and some of them can be acute. And I think God understands that based on various things that we read, such as this in Scripture. And so it may be that, like attending to a sick family member, that our labor obligations, which are divinely ordained, which we established earlier in this lesson, that is something that may on occasion take priority. And it's fundamentally different than missing worship for a frivolous reason. To just simply be gone doing something recreational does not fit into the same category of being gainfully employed, and on occasion having that employment create a conundrum of whether we should go to work or whether we should be at worship. It may be, in fact, tempting God to quit every job that we might have that presents a conflict with worship and then expect God to provide for us. I think we're living in a time where it's extremely difficult to find a job that would never create a conflict with us being at worship. Such is the nature of the kind of work we're doing and the amount of work that is being asked of us on occasion. Having said that, however, let's not go too far. Let's kind of moderate that. Perhaps more thought does need to be given to our career choices. Should we go into a career that we absolutely know is going to be a constant interference with our ability to worship God, that we will inevitably be kept away from worship service in a significant degree? And so we might want to distinguish a career where we miss worship on occasion from one where it's sort of the standard practice. Early on in my life, I had some thoughts. I'm probably not all that skillful at it, but I thought I was at one point, of wanting to be a professional golfer, maybe. But if you do well in golf, you always play that final round on Sunday. If you don't do well at golf, you play Thursday and Friday and miss the cut, but you don't get paid. So that's not very successful. So if you're going to be successful, you're going to be playing golf on Sunday. And I determined early on that would be something I would not do. There are other professions that almost guarantee that you're going to be interfered with in your worship or in your service toward God. And so it may be that we do need to give thought to that as we're developing our career path. What's going to allow me the best opportunity to be with God's people and to be worshiping God? And we also might need to ask this question: what will spiritually become of the man who frequently misses the assembly because of their job obligations? Do you think that man or that woman is going to be stronger because they frequently miss worship? So I don't believe we're talking about something that's benign here. to miss worship is a tragedy, whether it's because we're sick or working or whatever. I think, again, any conscientious Christian wants to be with their fellow Christians. But it may be that life interferes. In fact, it's interfering right now. And so we live in a real world of real problems and real issues and real needs. We live in a world where work pretty much goes on 24/7 in many cases, whether it's shift work or whether it's just long hours or more work than the fewer people can do. It's very difficult in this day and time to find a job that would never involve missing worship. Remember, in all of this, though, we work to live. We don't live to work. We work to live, to provide for ourselves and our families. And we should not allow work to become so central that it is our identity. It is the thing we focus on more than anything. It is our escapism from our families and our friends and our brethren. That is allowing work to get out of balance. Okay, we have a few minutes left. Question 1, what motive for working is given in Ephesians 4:28? Paul says, so that we might have something to give him who has need. So the more independent we are, and the more we're supplying for ourselves, we're equipping ourselves to be a blessing for other people. Question 2, discuss how modern attitudes toward work are at odds with the biblical concept. Well, I think one of the attitudes in the modern day toward work is everything. Your obligation to this company is everything. You ought to be willing to sacrifice time with your family, time away from God. You need to be able to sacrifice whatever to do for this company. And so it may be that our work environment urges us to put work in a higher place than it deserves. And so I have heard of Christians who have rejected promotions because they knew it would further interfere with their obligations toward God. That is very commendable. To give up a promotion is to give up pay. It perhaps is to put your job security at risk. But I appreciate those that do have their priorities in the right place. So work is everything. Work is the top priority. Pressure on women to work outside the home, to tell a woman she's not actualizing herself or fulfilling herself or otherwise developing herself in all of her potentiality. There's so many things that in the modern work world attack a woman and are very demeaning and belittling if she's not out there toe to toe, elbow to elbow with the men, working her way up the corporate ladder. What are some signs that a person may be placing too much emphasis on work? Well, neglecting the family. Children may be being neglected, especially not spending as much time with your spouse. The stress of the job dominates you. So it may be that your health begins to be compromised. You're not exercising as you should. Perhaps you're eating too much of the wrong things, whatever it may be. But you begin to see, even physically within yourself, the stress is building up, and it's just not healthy for me. Missing worship, as we've been talking about in these lessons. Too much voluntary travel. Again, enjoying being away from home, enjoying the perks of traveling. That may affect us. Feeling closer to our work family than we might feel toward our family at home. I've heard the terms work husband or work wife or whatever the modern terminology may be. That's not advisable for any Christian to be so known as or calling someone else, because it does strike up the closeness sometimes that we have more toward those in our jobs than our family. That's something to be guarded against very diligently. Question 4, what are some non-material benefits of productive labor? Well, a clear conscience, being able to sleep at night, feeling fulfilled, having purpose in our lives, having the discipline in our lives, as we talked about earlier, keeping ourselves out of trouble and helping us have a framework of living that helps us get the most out of every day. Gain insight into the world and other people and how they think and how they operate, how they function, gaining wisdom in all of that. There are people that we're coming in contact with that we might be able to teach and be a good influence on. So there are a lot of non-material benefits to productive labor, and I'm only touching on a few of these things with the answers to these questions. Hopefully you will examine these things in more detail yourself. Question 5, what problems does slothfulness create? Well, shame and embarrassment, dependence on others, a lack of respect from others toward us, anxiety over our own needs. No one likes the feeling of sort of living hand to mouth. If anything goes wrong in life, if I need a crown in my mouth or my car breaks down, I don't have any money on hand to take care of these things of life. So we're always in anxiety. The ruin of things that need our attention. We're not paying attention to the things that need our maintenance and upkeep. I'll just share anecdotally. There's a particular house in our neighborhood. It's owned by a landscaper, and his yard is trashed. It's the worst yard on the street, and it's just pure neglect. And he dumps dirt in the driveway, and it ends up washing down the road. His work trucks are sitting out on the street or in the parking lot, in his driveway. He's a landscaper I'd never hire, having seen his yard. So here's just an example of a man who I'm sure he feels like he does landscaping all day. He doesn't want to do his own house. It's sort of like the plumber whose pipes leak. But it does not speak well of us when others look to our lives and see slothfulness or neglect. And then lastly, this is one I would love to be able to discuss in person if we were able to meet. List 7 professions that have their counterpart in the work of the homemaker, and drawing from Proverbs 31 and then other things you can think about. The point is there's so many things that a woman can do and is called upon to do as a wife and a mother that other women get paid for out in the work world. In other words, they're saying, well, I want to go out in the world and do this and make a paycheck, when a wife and mother does all of those things and in doing so invests in her family, invests in her children and their nurture and their love and their care. I'm going to read through these quickly for the sake of time, but I just wrote purchaser, decorator, seamstress, nurse, chauffeur, recreational coordinator, mediator, counselor, teacher, launderer, banker, personal trainer, trip planner, gardener, and I hope you filled in a lot of blanks I didn't have there. That was 14, and I only asked you for 7. So we husbands and fathers have a great blessing and benefit in our wives because they're not out in the corporate world. Doesn't mean they're not working. They certainly are, and working very diligently and working very long hours and working a very important job to help support our families and our children. So let's love them and appreciate them as we should. So again, this is just touching the hem of the garment, but I hope we have given you some food for thought and maybe a new perspective on a thing or two, maybe open up some conversation with your husband or your wife or others that might help you even develop a better outlook on the job that you have or the labor that you're doing in life. So again, thank you for joining us tonight. We hope the study has been helpful to you, and have a good rest of the week.